Great.
This meeting is being recorded.
A warm welcome to all who are joining us today virtually and in person. My name is Nisha Krishnan, and I am the Director for Climate Resilience at the World Resources Institute in Africa. It is my honor and pleasure today to moderate this side event on addressing the adaptation finance gap in Africa and a regional perspective on a global challenge. The organizer is the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and we are very excited to have this event today. First, I wanted to give you an overview of what the agenda for today's event is like. First, we will hear from Mr. Hiroshi Kuniyoshi, who's the Deputy to the Director General of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, the organizer of today's event. And then I will be joined by four wonderful panelists, whom I'll introduce to you in a few minutes to discuss this topic from various perspectives. But before we start, I wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping rules, as always in these virtual events these days. For the audience attending the side event online, we encourage you to use a headset with an earpiece and microphone. Please use the chat function to address your questions and comments and to inform us of any issues you might be having with your video or audio or image and quality of this event. And please note that we do have simultaneous interpretation available in both French and English. Kindly use the interpretation Zoom function at the bottom of your screen and tune in the language that you would like to listen to. When speaking, please tune to that language channel as well on which you would like to speak, and we will hear your question in the languages that we've chosen as well. Without much further ado, I will invite you to watch this video of welcoming remarks by Mr. Hiroshi Kuniyoshi from UNIDO. Thank you.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I have the honor to welcome you to this side event organized by UNIDO, and I thank the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa for enabling this forum of dialogue on such a critical topic for sustainable development in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change is already causing disruption in every region in the world. Secretary General Antonio Guterres referred to the latest report of the IPCC as an atlas of human suffering. The IPCC report warns us that even if the world decarbonizes rapidly, the current emission trends will make disastrous climate impact unavoidable. The scenario of high emissions entails even worse consequences. Extreme weather events will become even more frequent. Species and ecosystems will face the threat of extinction. The results of climate change are devastating and often irreversible. Many countries on the African continent are those hit hardest by the impact on food security, health, economies, and ecosystems. Without inclusive development and targeted adaptation measures, climate change will push tens of millions more Africans into extreme poverty by 2030. This vulnerability is worsened by the limited financial capacity to promote effective adaptation. Despite the investments over the past few years, the magnitude of the projected climate impact far exceeds any existing adaptive capacity. Failure to adapt, in turn, fuels a negative feedback loop that undermines development and magnifies climate risks. This inequality and the high vulnerability of African countries, despite their relatively low contribution to the root causes of climate change, highlights a systematic injustice that adaptation funding must tackle. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to work together to increase ambitions more than ever. We need to increase funding, but above all, we need to turn our commitments into actions. We need to address challenges such as the lack of data, inadequate funding commitments, and the extremely limited private sector involvement in adaptation projects. Our efforts should be oriented towards raising ambitions at the forthcoming Sharm el-Sheikh Climate Change Conference. Multilateral funds need to remove or ease barriers to adaptation finance flows. More funding should be dedicated to key risk areas such as health and ecosystems, while prioritizing cross-sectoral approaches to adaptation planning. This would allow donors and governments to place more emphasis and funding on reducing risk across the interconnected sectors affected by climate change. For countries with difficulties in accessing the relevant knowledge and technologies, this will not be an easy task. Increased dialogue, cooperation, knowledge sharing, and partnerships will be essential. We at UNIDO are strongly committed to developing and sharing multilateral solutions guided by global solidarity and informed by science. We call for increased international cooperation to drive innovation and knowledge transfer, capacity building, and investments in least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states. Ladies and gentlemen, Nelson Mandela once said, "One cannot be prepared for something while secretly believing it will not happen." My call is for all of us to be fully conscious of the impact of climate change. We need to be prepared. We need to act together in unity. Let me conclude by wishing you successful deliberations. I hope the outcomes of this event will contribute to the overall discussion of the regional forum. Thank you.
Thank you to Mr. Hiroshi Kuniyoshi, the Deputy to the Director General of UNIDO, for those remarks. And now I just wanted to sort of set the scene as he had just done about what we are the challenges that we're dealing with. First of all, as you've just heard from the latest IPCC report that was released in April of this year, the climate impacts that we're facing are already more widespread and severe than expected, and we're locked into even worse impacts from climate change in the near term. Risks will escalate with higher temperatures, often causing irreversible impacts of climate change. And this is already affecting frontline communities much more than we thought. Inequity, conflict, and development challenges will heighten our vulnerability to climate risks, and dealing with these impacts and adapting are crucial. Adaptation includes activities and investments that reduce our vulnerability and better prepare us for the impacts. And these are all scales, from the most local community level to national level, and how we might budget for these risks, how we might use insurance to better prepare ourselves, and how we might change the nature of infrastructure investments, and or how we might look at water issues, agriculture, and there is a whole sort of set of institutions, people, and others who are very much invested in the adaptation challenge. But what the IPCC report also really actually highlights is that feasible solutions do exist, and that more support must reach vulnerable communities faster to really help them adapt to the impacts of climate change. And obviously, one of the topic that we are discussing today is that finance is crucial to being able to adapt. In 2009, developed countries committed $100 billion per year for climate change mitigation and adaptation at the UNFCCC conference in Copenhagen. While they have yet to meet that target, that commitment in full, climate finance is flowing, but not to the scale or the urgency and speed needed. And what we've realized is that much more finance is targeted to addressing or reducing the emissions, so mitigation activities, than for adaptation. And adaptation is growing in importance given the impacts that we're facing. And in 2019, only about 21 billion per year, according to the OECD, addressed adaptation globally. How might we scale this up? Is one of the conversations that we will be discussing today. And I wanted to go a little bit further and sort of set the scene for what finance is flowing to the African continent. Between 2014 and 2018, adaptation finance related commitments from multilateral and bilateral agencies to African countries was only about 5.5 billion per year, which is much less than far less than the needs of the continent, which range from about $20 to $70 billion per year now, but will increase in the future if we don't adapt faster. Funders have not strategically targeted support for adaptation activities towards what countries actually need and communities want, as well as not actually targeted to countries and communities that are the most vulnerable on the continent either. Lessons from these countries that have been helpful is that countries that have accessed finance point to the value of more sophisticated domestic planning priorities. So how we've integrated that into national planning or national development frameworks, how that has sort of influenced economic projections, as well as alignment of domestic priorities with NDCs, with the nationally determined contributions that countries have to submit on a 5-year basis to the UN, as well as country sophistication in sort of meeting requirements of international funders. And so this has all led to a low disbursement ratio for adaptation finance, in particular for countries on the continent. Disbursement rates are only about 46%, so half of what is asked for is sort of the level of financing that is coming to the African continent for adaptation. With that sort of framing of what the impacts are, what the risks are that countries here are facing, we wanted to sort of discuss what our esteemed panelists are already doing in this space, and to figure out how we might scale up adaptation finance, how we might reduce the barriers to accessing finance, and what could be expected of the discussions this year in the lead up to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, but also beyond, because this challenge is not going to go away anytime soon. With that, I would really like to introduce my panelists and colleagues in today's discussion. And first, we have Mr. Cohen Verbist, who's a program specialist for Unesco, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Welcome. Next, we have Mr. Tamer El Raghi, who's the Managing Director for Acumen's Resilient Agriculture Fund, and welcome to him as well. And third up, we have Mr. Ronan Ghani, who is the operating partner for Pegasus Capital Advisors. Welcome. And last but not least, we have Mr. Muhammad Asuyuti, who's a senior climate change specialist with the Adaptation Fund. And with that, I would like to start maybe posing a question to each of the panelists in turn, and then we'll have a more interactive discussion. When we do turn to the more interactive discussion, I do really encourage the audience in person as well as online to please use the Q&A or chat function to send us your questions, and we'll love to answer them as we go in turn. Thanks. First, maybe if I could turn to Mr. Asuyuti from the Adaptation Fund. More than $850 million has been committed by the Adaptation Fund to projects and programs around the world based on adaptation. What can we learn from these efforts? What have been the main setbacks, failures, and successes in this process? Over to you.
Thank you, and I hope you can hear me. I'm having some connection difficulties here. I'm here in Abidjan for the UNCCD CoM. Well, as you know, the Adaptation Fund has been set up initially to serve the Kyoto Protocol, and since 2019, we are officially serving the Paris Agreement. And as part of our effort to support countries to adapt to climate change, our portfolio has been growing. So as of today, the portfolio is almost about $1 billion as of today. I mean, throughout this process, we have learned a lot. And some of the key success that we can share is that we do believe that adaptation for us is a local issue, right? I mean, if you go to a vulnerable area, I mean, when you want to help countries to adapt to climate change, you need to deal with what they have in terms of needs. So at the Adaptation Fund, we believe that adaptation is really a local issue. So we make sure that everything we fund in terms of adaptation is coming from the country, responding to country needs. So country ownership for us is very important. So we don't have any, for example, any prescribed sector or any sector allocation where we provide funding. So we just fund everything that the countries have to submit to adapt to climate change. And I think this is important because at least it shows that there is an ownership, and then even the activities that you fund in terms of adaptation later are being owned by the communities. And then there is no sustainability or maybe long-term impact issues. The second key success thing that I want to share is that we do believe that access to finance should be very, very simple, right? I mean, at the Adaptation Fund, we have key processes that help countries to access directly to our funding. We call it direct access modality. The fund has been pioneering this direct access modality for years, and even some of sister organizations like the GCF has been now scaling up this process. So we really make sure that when it's possible, countries should get their national implementing entity accredited to us, so that when they mobilize funding, they do mobilize this directly to us, not going to necessarily to multilateral implementing entities, which are important too. In some areas, you need to have these kind of entities because obviously there is no national implementing entity, but sometimes these entities have their expertise to show us, so to help the countries. So direct access modality for us is really important. So it comes with some constraint, but in the long run, it's really important. At least it helps countries to get the capacity improved, and also to avoid some of the burden to go through different intermediaries. And the last key success that I want to share is that, I mean, now, as you have said, adaptation is really an issue when it comes to climate, but there are existing solutions. And in some areas, those solutions can be very innovative. So we tend to support countries to be innovative in tackling adaptation. So we have one of our key pillars under the current medium-term strategy is innovation. We have 3 pillars: action, innovation, and learning and sharing. But the innovation component for us is important because some countries can leapfrog some of these solutions to adapt to climate change. So now let's talk about some of the issues that we have maybe been dealing with and to help countries to access to climate finance. I think the first issue is, as you have said, is the demand, right? I mean, when you go to a country or to a vulnerable area, the issue they are facing are large, are immense, but the level of funding mobilized is very little. So we keep having this issue of funding mobilization, and it's important for the international community, for the parties to understand that adaptation is one of the, I mean, you cannot reduce vulnerability if you don't deal with adaptation. So as you say, less than 10% of climate finance goes to adaptation so far. If you take Africa, only 4%. At the Adaptation Fund, we tend to prioritize countries, of course. Each country has the same access to us. But if you take Africa, for example, more than 50% of our portfolio goes to Africa. So we believe that adaptation finance is really key and is still very lagging. So this is one of the issues we have. The second issue is capacity. I mean, at the local level, whatever we do, we need to make sure that these local people have access to finance, but they need to be capacity to deal with climate issues for the long run. So capacity for us is important. We are seeing this improving, but it's still very lacking. You know, we have our readiness program and so on, but capacity is an issue. So there is an opportunity for all the partners to work together to make sure that capacity is dealt in a synergetic manner, so that we don't lose some of the effort. And the last thing I will stop here is that when you go to some areas, I mean, there is a need to understand the climate dynamics, and the data is missing, right? If you go to some countries, some of the projects that are submitted to us are very very well written, but the climate or the adaptation rationale are sometimes lacking. So it's important for the countries to invest a bit on collecting and analyzing data to make sure that when they submit a project to any of the climate fund, not only the adaptation fund, they put very clear and well how the climate or the adaptation reasoning is being built. So I will stop here, but again, I mean, there are many things that we can discuss, and thanks again for inviting us at this side event. We're very grateful for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Asiuti. I wanted to say, I think you brought up a couple of issues that we will probably try to get into, but I think one that you obviously mentioned is capacity needs, which obviously is immense as well, given the scale of adaptation necessary and who needs to adapt, which is pretty much everyone, including ourselves. The second piece that I think you've highlighted is actually the local context of adaptation, right? So one of the reasons why adaptation hasn't taken off as much as potentially mitigation is that there is no one solution that fits all. It has to be very locally specific, and obviously in terms of mobilizing resources, that is very difficult if you have to develop a project or an idea for every location, even if there are similarities across that. It has to be sort of contextualized to local vulnerabilities, and at the end of the day, adaptation is very much intertwined with development. And so how do we do that across multiple actors going forward? So I think we'll come back to some of these issues in our discussion, but thank you very much for that overview. Next, if I could turn to Mr. El Raghi from the Acumen Brazilian Agriculture Fund. Although smallholder farmers produce a third of the world's food, climate change is threatening their lives and livelihoods. How is Acumen supporting smallholder farmers and communities on the African continent while contributing to closing the adaptation financing gap on the continent? And are there any lessons that you would share from the last few years of operation? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nisha, and thanks for the organizers for inviting us to share, the little we have learned over the past few years. The Acumen Resilient Agriculture Fund, we are an agri-impact VC fund that invests in early growth stage agri-startups in East and West Africa. So usually we invest in companies with business models that help smaller farmers adapt to climate change. So you find that we invest in solar power irrigation, we invest in backyard chicken, we invest in tomato processing. So we invest in those business models that help farmers adapt sustainable practices that help them not only increase their income and reduce their income volatility, but also diversify their sort of income, hence become more resilient to climate shocks. One of the things that we've learned is that the climate adaptation or products and services come in different shapes and forms. And if we look at, for instance, solar powered irrigation, farmers not only save on the cost of diesel, because usually farmers are in remote areas and diesel expensive, and diesel increases their carbon footprint, but also farmers report more than double of their yield. Because they have access to more clean water, they report more than 50% increase in their cow's milk yield. Last year it was a bad year everywhere. It's a COVID year, and when there was a survey done on Kenyan farmers on the effect of COVID on their well-being, more than 80% reported that they were worse off because of COVID compared to before COVID. While when the same survey was done on farmers that used solar powered irrigation, those same farmers report more than 80% of them report that they were better off. So having access to those products like have access to solar powered irrigation allowed them, even during a bad year like COVID, to have that sustainable source of income. And at the same time, but there are still challenges. It's far from being a rosy picture. There isn't enough funding. We always say that the continent needs 10 funds like ARAF that invest in commercially viable business models that not only help farmers adapt to climate change, but help them increase their income, reduce their income volatility through a commercially viable and sustainable growth of that business model. Because the more the company grows, the more farmers it affects. But a key challenge that we learned over the years is, cost of capital. When you look at cost of capital for those farmers, by the time they get access to those products and services, it's fairly high. Well, the cost of capital to the companies that provide those products and services is fairly high. Again, if you take irrigation as an example and you compare an African farmer to a farmer in Europe or the US, the cost of capital for that farmer in the US or Europe is in the single digit. Actually, it's low single digit when it comes to establishing, it's an infrastructure irrigation. While for African farmers, by the time the company borrows at 12% of the dollar, factoring in the default rate of the farmers, et cetera, cost of capital for the farmers when they pay for it over 2 or 3 years becomes in the upper teens, extremely high on the dollar. We are talking on the dollar. So there is definitely one of the lessons that we learned is that there is definitely need and room for blended finance, where we blend commercial financing with low-cost financing together with grants to significantly bring the cost of financing for those farmers, significantly bring it down so that those farmers can have access to more of those products and services. Thank you.
Thank you. I think what you're also pointing to is really interesting, this issue of cost of capital. One is that's often because we perceive that these technologies aren't necessarily yet commercially viable or seem risky. Secondly, that also is pointing to, I think, the state of financing in general and state of access for smallholder farmers for capital to just do normal business activities as well, right? And you're adding the sort of the complexity of climate change on top of that and adapting. So I think, and the other part that I think is interesting around the cost of capital discussion is the fact that often the benefits of investing in adaptation and resilience aren't actually actualized into the cost benefit analysis, right? And looking to see that this is actually a viable and or beneficial investment. So again, I think another thing that we might come back to in the discussion, but thank you for raising that point as well. Next, if I could turn to Mr. Ronan Ghani. Pegasus is a pioneer also in the private equity investing in sustainability and health. How is this contributing to closing the financing gap on the continent? And what would you share as some lessons that we might sort of start to discuss during the discussion as well? Over to you, Mr. Ghani.
Thank you very much. Hi, Nisha. I listened to the other panelists and I continue to take notes, and I'm completely now confused, don't know where to start. It's to follow my plan or just all what I heard before. Private investors, in order to convince private investor to come to this space, they need a lot of conviction for the reason that they have options. They really have other options to go with their money. And what I normally hear is when you listen to a lot of big fund, private equity funds, the famous one, everybody's supporting adaptations. But when I look on the hundreds of them, I think maybe one from 100 will really bring his private investments into those type of projects. And Pegasus Capital is one of them. And what we're doing, we actually doing stuff that are quite basic. I mean, we're taking our money with the support of our shareholder, and we're investing across big specters. We're investing in water, clean water for agriculture. We're looking on the gentleman before me spoke about agriculture, and me as a private investor, I didn't know much about agriculture before, but now we're looking on investment in the cold storage, and actually in the country that we're now speaking in. And I was amazed that I'm seeing investment cases that 30% of the crop that just don't survive because there is no place of a cold storage. And the expensive crops, they shipping it to Europe and then bring it back to sell it in the local market 6 months after. So Pegasus Capital basically look on those type of assets: water, cold storage. We're replacing diesel with renewable. I think what also is very important is the problem with big investments from the private sectors is we like to have big investments. There is not so many people of us, so the idea is that a team of 3-4 people will work on a $5 million investment. Just doesn't make sense to the people who make decisions. So we in Pegasus basically tackled this issue, and we basically said we will also invest in assets that it's around 5 million. And we also said, okay, in some places 5 million is still a lot of money. So we basically created a technical assistance fund that can go in and not even make investment. It's almost a grant facility, quite a big one, in order to facilitate future investment. And this is where I can approve 50,000, 20,000, 100,000, 200,000 to help local developers to basically bring their project to the next level. One of the biggest challenges that we find is the following: lack of developers. I think I started in Africa 12 years ago. There were way more developers than now. The second thing that we see is the lack of knowledge of the existing development, to which level they need to reach in order to make the investment possible. Because, you know, there's all the time banks there that you need to convince them to be your partner. Remember, equity investor are taking the first risk and then the bank come later. So you need to make sure that they're happy. So that's why we have the technical assistance fund, in order to really help help developer to come to the right level. We're also working very close with IUCN, they are partner of our gold standards, to make sure that we tick all the boxes from a point of ESG. Because 5 years ago, 8 years ago, people really didn't know what is ESG. And I think still people don't know what is ESG now, because I listened to an article, I'm sure you guys know, that there's ESG fund that invest in Apple because they are ESG, but this is not the reason to call yourself an ESG investor when you put your money in Apple. So we have IUCN gold standard to really make sure that our money is really challenging to the right location. And the last thing, and this is for the, I think the person just spoke before me, we are basically a blended finance fund. We take first loss. Our LPs, one of them can take the first loss. We can take a minimum return, because we know that we will need to have this flexibility, agility, in order to make the investment happen. And I think the last thing I want to say is that we need to change and thinking of when we thought about coronavirus. When we had coronavirus, the world has shifted, changed, actually go from second gears to 15 gear in order to resolve an issue. If we will continue like this of 5 billion a year, 10 billion a year, 20 billion a year, it's just not enough. And the only way to bring it, it's not from grant money, it's not from DFI money, it's convince the mountains of private money outside that it makes sense for them to spend the time, that they can get answer to the risks. And the only way to really make a transformation is bring those private investors in. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Ghani. I think, yes, what you're saying is that we need to get all finance aligned with these goals, both on the mitigation side, but also on the adaptation side, and to really understand, I think that the volume of capital that is available in the private sector is sort of no match, I guess, or public finance is no match. No, private finance is no match for private capital. The other thing that I think you bring out, a couple of things, is about the size of investments. And I think Mr. El-Raghy was also talking about this partially, which is that if you think about smallholder farmers, they don't need millions of dollars. Whereas the way that private capital, especially sort of the larger financiers, work is that you do need size, right? You need economies of scale for you to be able to mobilize as quickly as you would like to. And I think this issue of pipeline development and bankable proposals and projects is actually something that is sort of common across both the public side of this issue of the adaptation finance gap as well as the private side. And I think on the public side, there is also challenges in sort of making this attractive to the DFIs that the development finance institutions that you were talking about, the NDBs. And on the private side, it is also based on this need for returns, right? At some point, private capital does need returns, whether it comes next year or in 5 years or in 10 years, there needs to be there needs to be a return, regardless of whether the capital is patient or not. So I think you've brought out a couple of other things that we'll probably pick apart. And I guess I should have commented on this before. I think this is one of the first adaptation finance panels that I've moderated that has as many private sector oriented folks as public sector. So this is really interesting that we're having this discussion. And I think there are a couple of things that we can come back to in the following discussion. Maybe if I could turn to Mr. Verbist next from UNESCO. The objective of the UNESCO strategy for action on climate change is to enable member states to take more urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts through education, science, culture, and information communication. How is UNESCO supporting member states to bridge this funding gap? And what have you learned in this process? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Nisha. And I talk indeed from the region because I'm based in Harare, covering Southern Africa, but of course also looking over some of the regional challenges. So the strategy itself, just to summarize it, it focuses on 4 thematic areas and covers 4 out of the 5 sectors of UNESCO. So it's to support member states to develop and implement climate change education and public awareness programs. Also, secondly, to promote interdisciplinary climate knowledge and scientific cooperation for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Thirdly, to promote cultural diversity, which is our sector, and cultural heritage safeguarding against climate change impacts. And finally, also to ensure that we have inclusive social development, looking at ethical and gender equality principles. So when we're looking at the challenges in the African continent, it's clear, of course, that the increase in disasters, and particularly water-related disasters such as floods, droughts, landslides, will be affecting the most vulnerable communities in the region. And I've been also witnessing that myself here in the area. So UNESCO is therefore heavily supporting its member states to address these challenges, but also to ensure that we secure together more financing for such a proactive climate risk management that we are promoting. So in practice, this means securing financial resources, for example, for community-based monitoring and early warning system. And let me just start with that one first. So there's a clear agreement that there is a need for climate risk management, but we also see that there is a bit of a donor fatigue with the setup of early warning system for African countries. As we have many examples, and I've witnessed several myself, of failed attempts to make such systems operational and sustainable, especially when they are funded by external resources which run out over a certain amount of time. And we've seen over and over again new initiatives trying to mitigate those issues. So certainly there is a bit of a fatigue, but I think at the other side, there's also an appetite with donors to re-engage because the need is clear. We need more and more early warning systems when our climate stresses are going up. And in this sense, we have been set up a bit of a different approach where we try to anchor it much more in the communities. And we're using our multi-sectoral mandate in this sense to deliver this. For example, linking it with community radios, which also allows another entry point for communication that is, of course, important to bring early warning into early action. But of course, disaster risk reduction education that needs to be brought on board to make sure that there's local awareness and capacity building. And to ensure that no one is left behind, we need to make sure that also vulnerable people with disabilities are targeted. And of course, this more integrated way of dealing with solutions is also bringing more opportunities for resources, because then you're tapping on different funds that target maybe more siloed approaches, for example, on communication, on science, on education. So you can bring them all together and be more successful in approaching this challenge. And for example, this has been quite successful over the last few years with funding from Austria, Flanders, Belgium, Japan, and South Korea. But also UN-to-UN funding has been made available after, for example, Cyclone Idai in 2019. And is another example of what they say, never waste a good crisis. And such profoundly impacting events, which are more and more attributed to climate change impacts, are often drivers of change. And we see that over and over again. And a recent example was actually the Durban floods a few weeks ago, where more than 300 people died. So where the rainfall event that caused the flooding is expected to become now a 1 in a 20-year event, compared to what it was in 1 in a 40-year event before. So in the other case of the 2019 Cyclone Idai, as a result of that, we see a lot of resources pouring into the region. For example, the World Bank released $70 million to Zimbabwe alone to support recovery, but also included resilience building to climate change. And to be honest, it was actually quite a challenge to convince them to put a lot of resources, not just in recovery, but actually into resilience building, because it's often seen as like not a very tangible result. So in fact, UNESCO was able to convince them to support Zimbabwe to set up early warning systems, but also to develop adaptation strategies, which is actually a key component of the other part of our work. So in fact, for that, we launched in 2018 a new strategy, which is also, of course, a driver for new resources. And that strategy is called Climate Risk Informed Decision Analysis, or CRIDA. And it has been a major approach to secure funding for countries to adapt. So what it actually does, it's moving towards what we call a bottom-up approach, where we basically involve local stakeholders heavily in the design of the problem statement, but also identifying adaptation actions that are evaluated as part of an adaptation pathway. And this ensures that, of course, adaptation is adapted to local, socio-economical, and cultural environments, and taps into the local indigenous knowledge and capacities that are available. And in fact, and some of the partners already mentioned that here on the call, is that such community-based approaches are a requirement when it comes to climate finance, and both the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund require an active involvement of communities in the design and implementation of adaptation strategies. So by promoting such approaches, UNESCO ensures that funding can be secured more easily by member states. An example is our recent Adaptation Fund project we developed together with Zimbabwe for $5 million that embraces such approaches and that identify locally supported adaptation pathways, and therefore also was approved by the board. And a third component of UNESCO strategy is to involve what we call the designated sites. And UNESCO counts with 3 types of sites. We have World Heritage Sites, as you might know, bioreserves, and more recently, geoparks. And particularly, bioreserves are very well suited and have the objective to become demonstration sites for sustainable development and laboratories for climate change adaptation. And it's also a major opportunity for fundraising, as member states can receive financial support to designate and operationalize these areas, which are often biodiversity hotspots under threat of climate change. But of course, the communities living close to those biodiversity hotspots need support to adapt to climate change and also to become drivers of sustainable development. So tackling those things at the same time is very interesting also for donor agencies and funds. And it's just in a nutshell a few of the approaches that we are supporting to our member states to address climate change adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think what you're also, as you said, you're sort of highlighting the importance of involving local communities in deciding as well what they need for adaptation and how they might be empowered to do that better. The importance, I think, actually, your last example was actually getting to the importance of nature in this conversation in adaptation. And I think the increased attention to nature-based solutions is something that is sort of starting to permeate the adaptation sort of conversation and how we might actually tackle multiple challenges through adaptation, right? So how we might better restore and protect our forests, how we might better actually have better water quality through these issues, through addressing nature. But I thank you very much for that as well. I maybe wanted to, if I could summarize very briefly, I think some of the things, the common themes that have come up, and then maybe we can have an actual full panel discussion. So hopefully all of us can be on the screen at the same time. I think what has come out is this the very importance of local context, right? So actually involving local communities in the decision-making or national governments, and how that has, that really leads to the ownership of both the issue and the solution. At the end of the day, this is not meant to be, adaptation is not meant to be imposed externally. It is very much community driven and owned, and such that it is sustainable over time, but that is also effective. That seems to also be very crucial even to the private sort of capital conversation, because at the end of the day, the solution needs to be sustainable over time, and communities, if they're invested in these actual solutions, more likely will invest their own capital in it. The second piece is actually this issue of data limitations, pipeline development, and it's sort of and the complexity, I guess, of local context and the lack of data or lack of capacity, and how that affects pipeline development, right, of the ideas and the investments that are necessary, but also what that complicates is sort of the private access to private capital, or even public capital in this case. So that's another piece that I think has come out. The third piece is around sort of the cost of capital and sort of the realization or the valuation of benefits of investing in resilience, and how that might actually affect the cost of capital for both smallholder farmers, or just in general, anyone who is borrowing to do adaptation related work, especially in the private sector. I think those are some of the larger, I think, sort of themes that have come out. But maybe if I could just ask all of you, what do you think are specific policies, measures, or actions that could be pursued to overcome some of the financing gaps that and challenges that you've experienced in your work? Maybe if I could go in reverse order, over to you, Mr. Verbist, first, and then I'll bring in the rest.
Right. Yeah, I think just speaking on your thing is indeed that if you see the last IPCC report, of course, that it's pledging also for adaptation to be accelerated, and that this is the decade for making that happen. And in fact, if we want to meaningfully address impacts of climate change, adaptation has to happen now. I think that's a very powerful statement, and I think it also means we need to accelerate funding for that. What I also see a lot is that indeed there's a lack of engagement of local communities, and of course they then often become to more of a national level actions, which are of course important, but then they have to really be adjusted locally. And I think that's where we have been focusing on, is not trying to go at the national level, but really trying to identify those areas that really need to be tackled. And of course, you can identify hotspots based on, for example, the challenges related to cyclones or other threats that are in those areas, and trying to work in a more of a let's say established format. And I think UNESCO has its tools and it's using it in this way. And I think just highlighting a few things here. WMO and UNESCO are to make a pledge in a few weeks where they will highlight that they would like to become the agencies driving the setup of early warning systems in all countries worldwide within the next 5 years. I think that's quite ambitious, but it's also highlighting the need for these activities to be rolled out across the world. Because without early warning, of course, we become much more vulnerable to the hazards that are occurring. And we see that very clearly. If you compare, let's say, Western nations to African nations, you can easily see that there's much more casualties in those nations that don't have adequate early warning systems. So that's, of course, making the case for that. And of course, we also make sure that our own networks, such as, for example, the more than 700 bias reserves worldwide, get supported financially. And that's also a struggle. I see that also as something we need to really put more effort into, to make sure that they really can play the role to engage their communities to adapt to climate change. That's already a lot of area in the world that can really be used to accelerate adaptation. And maybe just to give an example of that is when Cyclone Idai hit Eastern Highlands of Zimbabwe, UNESCO said, okay, let's just make sure we do this right. And one of the approaches was to identify with the member state if designating it as a bias reserve would be an opportunity. And in fact, it was. And this also makes sure that the bias reserve becomes a driver of change. It brings everybody around the table. It makes sure that we're not just talking to a few stakeholders in an area, but we make sure that all stakeholders are represented, from the businesses, the farmers, the local communities. Everybody is on the table. And that means that your solutions are also much more encompassing. And so when you come then in with a climate change adaptation strategy, such as the CRIDA approach we have been using to do climate stress test adaptation actions, you have the whole community to talk to. And that also means that when you have solutions being proposed, they're actually carried by the community and they can actually be implemented by the community. And in this case, of course, the recommendations to the World Bank and to UNOPS to actually implement those infrastructural works, and they have been implementing them since then with the community agency. So I think it makes sense to really go a bit slower, but at the same time more profound in terms of changing how we deal with adaptation through a more longer process. And maybe one thing you mentioned on data is also, of course, that there is need for having more access to data and also experience on how to model climate change impacts. It's not an easy task to do. And that's also why UNESCO has been promoting what we call a recommendation for open science, which has been endorsed by all our member states in November last year in the General Conference. So in fact, this actually drives also the agenda for UNESCO to make everything openly available, open access, not only to data, but also to models, to publications, but also to hardware, to make sure that everything we do in terms of monitoring is also be able to be transferred and be modified locally. So in fact, this is also a new impetus for activities on the ground and making sure that resources are being put in sustainable solutions that can be modified locally. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Maybe if I can ask, I believe that would be Mr. Ghani next, if we're going in reverse order. What would make your life easier? What are the specific policies or measures or actions that could really help you advance more investments on the continent?
So we need to understand the set of mind of private investors. Private investors, they want to see stuff relatively clear. They want to have an existing policies that was tested before. Private investors also don't like to be first. They want to see that things like this happened, and then the money will flow in. The unique, as I said, from 100 organizations, maybe there is one who is willing to invest in adaptation today, and Pegasus is one of them, is this one, and so we are basically willing to just take the next few steps in order to solve risks that normally other investment don't see or don't like to face. And one of the biggest issues is how the revenue profile of the project, what the investor, how are we going to raise debt alongside his investments, and how we will get financial support on the revenue in order to make sure that the whole project can happen. I give you an example. In the early 2000s, Europe decided that they want to move to renewable. So they basically create a feeding tariff that basically says something simple. The moment that you are connected to a local grid, we as a government must buy the electricity from you. In a matter of a couple of years, thousands of megawatts, and everything started in Germany, then Spain, this Italy, and then a government policy that was absolutely very clear created the private investors to just pile in to something that they really like. So I will take the gentleman who just spoke before me from UNESCO. He wanted to do an early warning worldwide. So my advice is, let's not use donation money to do that, because you just need to sit with private sector and basically tell them, look, if you invest this in those type of countries and and we know we investor of an infra, so it's taken 20 years. So we can wait, and our funds can be up to 15 years. It's a long-term patient money. So the whole idea is basically said, okay, if you invest X, this is how the revenue will come. This is because what we normally facing is that the banks to raise the debt are so rigid, and it's so difficult to convince them that they have the right political risk, the right policies, dealing with conversion on currencies. There is so many issues that we need to resolve. So the whole idea is just make the investment clear and who is responsible. And one thing that it's an issue for investors is if we go very, very local issues and local communities and putting a lot of responsibility with locals, we don't have the capacity, the manpower to really deal with the local communities, municipalities, and that's why for larger program, they must be involvement of, I can say it, a combination of local government with local communities, because we just cannot reach to the really tiny developer, tiny farmers. Investments that can work like into cooperative that gather like 500 farmers. So then they need a meaningful amount of money with a very clear vision of how it's going to be invested and how you're going to harvest the success of this investment. This is what we can do. To expect from local private investor who sit normally in northern hemisphere to travel to meet local villages, as much as we love to do it, it will not happen. We just need to bring it one step up and solve a lot of other issues like land issues, transmission line issues, dealing with ministerials. This is really what helped local investor, international investor to invest in local markets.
Great, thank you. I mean, I think you've brought up incentives, right? So clear government policies and directives that would really support mobilization of capital. Second, I think it's interesting that you bring up essentially an issue about intermediaries and needing more intermediaries potentially who can help collate investments. Maybe if I could turn to Mr. El-Raghi next, I believe, what would make your life easier in this world?
Well, we are based in Nairobi, so let me talk about things that we see every day, effective climate change that we see every day with smaller farmers. We visit those farmers all the time that are working with our portfolio companies, and it's not about only our companies. The sector, generally speaking, needs quick wins that will show that it is doable to deliver commercial returns, because as I believe Ronan mentioned before, you need to DFI money is great, but the big money is with private investors, and we saw that when we were raising our fund, and when we raised our fund as back in 2019, our first close, and we were at that time the first equity fund to be focused on climate adaptation. Talking to private investors, even though we have private investors in our fund, but the big ones, always think of investing in the ag space in Africa as a space where no one can make money. Okay, so quick wins is something that we believe we should focus on. Ironically enough, one area that we are working on right now with different stakeholders is irrigation. There was a report that was published showing that in Kenya, where Kenya spends more than $2 billion on importing food every year, a subsidy for smaller farmers of $100 million would catalyze investments of more than $400 million, resulting ultimately in food production that will bring Kenya to food security. So when you first hear the number, $100 million, that's not much as a subsidy. but at the same time, first you need, of course, you need the policy, and then you need the government to start working with the right stakeholders to develop a pilot program to prove it, and then have that as a quick win, showing that it is doable when you align the right stakeholders to have something that is commercially viable and meaningful. So that will bring more governments to participate in similar programs. It doesn't have to be around irrigation. It's, the space for agribusiness is so wide open, but we have to have that support of different stakeholders and definitely governments.
Great, thank you. I mean, it sounds like what you're also pointing to is just having leadership and vision to actually invest in some of these policies, as well as bringing the right stakeholders around the table. But I also feel like there was potentially a private deal that I missed to highlight, which is that you offered to, sorry, Mr. You offered to potentially, what's it called, finance early morning systems earlier. So I should put you and Mr. Verbis should talk later about the early warning, financing the early warning systems plan that he was talking about. So in any case, Mr. Asayut, I wanted to turn to you in terms of, from the adaptation fund perspective, what policies and measures would make your work easier, but also how you might be able to address the financing gap that you're also seeing.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, despite all the challenges we're facing, all of the issues about adaptation, things are improving. I mean, from Glasgow to Sharm el-Sheikh, adaptation is gaining momentum. The gap in terms of adaptation finance is still very huge, but we're seeing more and more countries stepping in to help vulnerable countries adapt to climate change. I mean, there are some low-hanging fruit that we believe should be really used. I mean, when it comes to local solutions, I mean, there are really many of them that are existing, and we believe that they should be implemented and not necessarily looking for countries to look for different things. So for example, innovation for us is important. So I mean, in many countries, innovative solution can be very basic, can be very little. Drip irrigation in some countries are very, very, very small, very innovative. So we believe that those can be improved. Yeah. So this is one. I mean, just tap onto something that is local, innovative, and then that can help countries. The other thing that I want to mention is that in many countries, countries have started working on national adaptation plans, those NAPs, but those NAPs are still very, very based on concepts. So we think that maybe it's time to move from concept to something that it can be transformed into project, like this bankable project, this project that can be implemented. So we think that maybe this is an area where all the partners can come together, help countries to transform these NAPs into something that we as fund can help them implement. And this gap is really important. Is huge now. I mean, most of the NAPs, for example, now include many ideas, and they are not necessarily ready for implementation or for funding. We do have some project preparation ground which can help countries to move from ideas to concrete project, but it's still a bit at early stage. And last thing I would say that maybe there are too many partners now that are ready to help on adaptation finance, but we are not necessarily talking to each other. You know, when you take the climate funds, for example, we do have some complementarity and coherence, but let's not forget the private sector. I mean, as some of the panelists have said, I mean, if we need to address the adaptation finance gap, we need to tap into private sector. And for now, this is not really well done. So this complementarity and coherence shouldn't be only among public funders. It should be beyond that. I mean, private entities, for us, Adaptation Fund, we don't have a window which can help private entities to fund project on the ground, but the other funds have that. So perhaps, I mean, this is an area where we need to do more and to see how the adaptation finance gap can be closed by really making sure that the private sector entities are being welcome, right? In many countries, there are so many enabling environment that are not available. There are so many constraints, and those cannot be addressed if we don't talk to each other. So I will stop here, but again, I mean, things are really improving. From our side, we believe that adaptation finance gap, although it's still huge, but the momentum we have now in climate adaptation finance gives hope, at least. Yeah, thanks.
That's great, thank you. I think one of the things that maybe at this point, first of all, I would definitely welcome any audience questions, either from in person in Dakar or online. Please do send us your questions. But maybe if I can pick up something that is coming out, one is that we do want local ownership and local communities sort of involved in the design. But on the flip side, especially for private capital, that seems something that, you know, they don't necessarily, Mr. Ghani, you were pointing to the fact that you don't necessarily, for example, or really large private investors don't have the capacity to collate all those ideas, right? So what are potentially some solutions that could help us meet in the middle? The fact that we want local ideas and local ownership, but yet capital, especially private capital, can't necessarily be the instigator for those ideas because of the scale challenge, right? You can't go to each and every community to sort of collate those ideas of what the investments are needed. So what are potentially some solutions to help addressing this divide? And I understand that's a huge question, but what are things that could really address that challenge? And maybe I could start with Mr. Verbies, back to you as to how we might actually address this.
Yeah, just following up on what Mahamat and some others as well said, is that I agree that there is really this gap between the national adaptation plans and concrete on-the-ground projects. And I see that a lot when I engage with my national stakeholders, that they're really focusing on the national level, while in fact, the challenges are really local. So I think we need to bridge that gap rapidly, because if not, we're going to be trying to implement very broad ideas and sectoral approaches to a local scale, which is not going to be a good fit. So I think we really need to also promote the bottom-up approaches against just the top-down approach. And I see some of these processes, especially at COP level, are really driving it from global to regional to national to local. But I think it also needs another process that comes from the bottom up. And I think the Adaptation Fund and other funds actually are doing that by actually requiring that the local level is involved from the start and is driving the project. So I think that's a good thing, and I agree with you probably that climate financing is improving, and you see many more actors coming on board, even private sector entities that you would not expect would be investing. So I think we also see that happening, and I hope we can indeed bring them into a meaningful contribution. And also just to highlight indeed what you also said is that the need for looking for local solutions. I see a lot of these times also that external investors think that they need to bring in external capacity to do adaptation, and often it's not necessary. Often there is a lot of experience already in the area on adaptation, or at least to making things much more water secure or much more adapted for ecosystem services, which are not being used because those entities are often locally funded. They're not really very well developed, and they're often not connected to those discussions which we are having on climate finance. So they're actually not adding, they're not connecting to those sources. And when you do connect them, it's actually a win-win, because of course we don't have to invent the wheel. We bring in solutions which already have been tested, tried, and trusted by the local communities, and can easily be upscaled. And I think we also have a role there to play, to not just looking for resources, but also connecting the different entities that need to be connected. And I think in our last experience in Zimbabwe, we actually recommended the World Bank not to bring in external consultants, but working with local community-based organizations that had been piloting examples of solutions for more than 20 years. So I think that's also a thing that I wanted to highlight to this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, I think part of it though is that it sounds like because of your presence in Zimbabwe, you're able to identify these partners, right, that could stand in. But I guess the question now is, how do we scale that sort of identification of local partners up in such a way that private capital, for example, could flow much easier, such that that legwork potentially doesn't have to happen? Or is that always going to be the case? So maybe Mr. Asayut, Mr. Ghani, Mr. El-Raghi, please do come in. I want this to be a little bit more dynamic. So whoever would like to take the floor, please go ahead.
Okay, so I will go first. Thank you. Look, I totally agree that using any local help is absolutely essential. But what we would like to see is an increase in quantities in a short period of time in order to meet the targets. And in order to achieve that, I don't know, in the next 5 to 10 years, we just need to acknowledge that there is a progress, but is this progress enough? And I have a problem is that I just don't have the solution. And I'm happy to admit that, because I'm in a way a simple investor that have capacity to invest in those sectors with a limited amount of time. And as I said, I maximum have 12 hours to work a day. Anything above this, I have problem at home. And as a result, I really need to focus. So, and when I engaged those transactions, we cannot just create something from zero, international investors. We need local organization, local developer, NGOs to kind of do some step in order to make our life a bit easy, to start to really work and invest in the project. For me, I'm working currently with a local developer, not in Africa, but in Latin America. And what I see that it's really interesting is that people who learn outside the countries coming back, have their initiative, build their initiative locally, and they really have the energy to put project together, knowing the locals, what's required to do. And when we speak with them, it's something that make our life so much easy, because we get a lot of investments and you just need to go around them and just said, where are you going to spend your 12 hours a day? And for me, if I think what I would like to see, I would like to see a local developer who have knowledge, and we also will be willing to fund them. So they need some funding in the first couple of years to build their capacity, have the knowledge. This is what will help. The municipality level supposed to be really supportive. Mayors in cities supposed to help. All of this basically making the jigsaw for us much easier. And I don't know who exactly supposed to do all of that, but if it's NGO, municipality, local developer, investing in graduate program in universities. I mean, this is for me so important. If we can bring to London, if somebody will create a program and come to private equity from each country, pick 25 graduate to bring to any country and to support them for 1 year or 2 years. This is such a great investment for the next year. And this is not a project related. This is a strategic decision. So stuff like this really, when we meet those guys who have this, make our life much easier and basically give us the ability to make the investment.
Great, thank you. Mr. El-Raghi Rasayoud.
Yeah, maybe I can say something here. Well, as I said, at the Adaptation Fund, we really think that local action is key to adaptation. And we don't only say it, we make available some tools and instruments for people to really act at the local level. So let me give you an example. So at the Adaptation Fund, we have an instrument called Enhanced Direct Access. So it's an EDA funding window, which help communities and countries to mobilize funding from the Adaptation Fund and manage it at the very local level. So this funding helps countries, for example, to implement projects with funding that is managed by the communities. And sometimes these fundings are managed by the municipalities. It can be managed by local groups of people who can demonstrate some fiduciary standard and so on. And this can be done through some on-lending of grant, or it can be done through some funding management through MFIs or financial institutions. And under this window, the local communities are really on board, right? Because they identify the project, they manage the funding, which fund this project, and they are the one who do even the reporting to the implementing entity, which reports to us. So by doing so, we believe that the EDA is a way to empower the local communities to adapt to climate change. So they identify the solution, they get the funding, and they manage the funding. So throughout this process, we really think that they are gaining some real capacity on dealing with adaptation. Right? So this is an option that works pretty well. We have a project in South Africa where some of the municipalities have been able to manage some funding from the Adaptation Fund. We have another example in Costa Rica where local groups of fishermen have been empowered and funded to support local actions on the ground. So we think that those kind of ideas maybe should be tested. I mean, I know the GCF has an EDA program as well. So this is maybe one area to empower local actors. But on the other side, there are some issues, right? I mean, some of these local actions come with their challenges. They can be very costly because you have I mean, doing monitoring of multiple small projects is quite costly. And also you need to make sure that the project identification is properly done. So you need to make sure that the communities have funding to do some consultation, to identify the right solution and so on. So this is something that we think is a cost to pay, because otherwise you just keep saying that local action is important, but you don't provide the solution. So this is maybe an example that we as Adaptation Fund we believe should be continued. I will maybe end by saying that there are many actions, many partners around out there that are supporting local action. Last year, we have been working with some of the partners like the Global Commission on Adaptation, WRI. We come up with this principle for local-led adaptation actions. And those principles are really, I mean, they are not binding in the sense that you need to apply them in your operation, but they are kind of a guidelines, and they are very good. If all of the partners working on adaptation just apply those principles, we'll do great things. So for us, we have committed ourselves to at least make sure that these principles are applied in our portfolio. Although we have our investment criteria and review criteria, but we believe that those kind of initiatives should be really implemented by all those who believe that local action is important. I will stop here. Thanks.
Thank you. And Mr. Haragi, you have the last word.
Yeah, a couple of quick points. The first one, we always envy our colleagues investing on the climate mitigation side, because there is always something to measure. They always use the how many tons of CO2 have they prevented as a number to celebrate. On the adaptation side, unfortunately, there isn't one number that we can use. So even when you talk to different people, they look at climate adaptation differently, and what it means for farmers, even they look at it differently. Some people always think as irrigation, some as seeds, etc., etc. So that's a challenge, I think, for all of us to come up with and we don't have a solution for it. We're developing a way of measuring the climate resilience of the farmers working with our portfolio companies, but I don't think there is a silver bullet yet. The second point I'd like to talk about, which I think it was Ronan that mentioned it earlier, which is large funds or investors with large ticket size. They need large projects. They need large companies to invest in. But to have those large companies, you need to start somewhere. You need companies to start, and then you need accelerators or /incubators, and then you need VC funds. So as I mentioned earlier, as a manager of the VC fund that's focused just on ag and climate adaptation, we need more. We need way more of funds like ours, and definitely we see that for the pipeline for us, and hence for larger funds later on. We need national programs that actually catalyze the space by establishing accelerators /incubators focused on the ag space and focus on promoting the concept of climate adaptation and climate adaptation business models in the ag space. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I mean, it sounds like what we really need is sort of smaller scale intermediaries or sort of collators of information, right? So Mohammed, you were just talking about the local-led adaptation principles, but part of it is that we also, that sort of patient flexible financing that the locally-led adaptation principles calls for also needs to be matched with actual ideas to be invested in, right? So, you know, how do we do that matching at a larger scale such that, you know, capital that is there, that is willing to go. So there's capital that's willing to go, there's capital, potentially private capital, that is not really yet interested in adaptation or in climate risks, which, you know, is a different problem, I think. But what we need to do really is the matchmaking aspects of it, and that could really help help us overcome some of this financing challenge that we're seeing, given the scale of investment that is necessary from the most local level, but also to your larger infrastructure projects, right? The roads that need to be built, the bridges that need to be built, those all need to be climate resilient going forward, and needed to be adapted to the new reality. We have 8 minutes, so I was going to suggest that each of the panelists takes 2 minutes and give me your top one takeaway from this session, what you will hopefully be working on or are interested in pursuing in sort of the adaptation challenge going forward. Maybe Mohammed, you first.
Yeah, thank you. So we are at the end of our medium-term strategy, which covered the period 2018-2022, and we are now working on a new strategy. And we're very happy with how the current MTS has delivered results. So we are going to basically renew it with some adjustment. One of the things that we believe is key is really doing concrete actions on the ground. I mean, the Adaptation Fund has been funding concrete and tangible projects on the ground. And we believe that with the modest size of our fund, it's important for us to continue focus on that. And then the other thing that we really believe is important is the issue of innovation. I mean, innovation is really important for us. I mean, if you are able to do some technology transfer or even help countries to innovate in adaptation, you can basically maximize the climate impact and the climate benefit. And as I was saying, in some areas, innovation can be very basic, and it can really change things on the ground. So we really think that this is where we can make a real change. And again, we continue to advocate for local actions. I mean, the Adaptation Fund for us, direct access and local action is really an important thing. We think that by doing things at the local level, we are really helping a local issue to be solved. So local adaptation action for us is key. We are continuing to deliver on direct access modality. But there are challenges. So I mean, some of the key takeaways from this discussion, and I'm very grateful for all of these insights here, is that I mean, no one can provide solution alone. I mean, we need to partner with all the organizations here. And although we don't support a project through private sector entities, we really value what they can bring on the ground. So we really hope that there are options that we can provide. They can propose for private sectors. So under the innovation window, we have one funding window that allows all type of entities to access Adaptation Fund. This can be I mean, everything. So maybe this is an area where this is an entry point for us, maybe to engage with the private sector. But again, the capacity at the local level has to be solved. You know, if there is a way to help countries to access climate finance, it's not to give them funding, but it's to make sure that they understand what climate finance means and how they can make that a long and sustainable funding for their adaptation needs. And I think that moving from NAPs to concrete actions is important. I will stop here. Thanks.
Thanks. Sorry, me too. Thanks very much. Maybe next, Mr. Vervis, your one key takeaway from this, and if you don't mind keeping to time, thank you.
Yeah, just maybe adding one more thing is that, of course, we're looking at COP27 in Egypt. And I think one of the things that we saw only happening just recently, and that was in Glasgow, was that there was just now being a pavilion made for water. Which is the first time it happened, and the second time will now be in the COP27. So in fact, this is a key moment also to bring water more to the forefront and to make sure that we really look at our countries tackling the challenges, because water is the way we're going to feel climate change impacting our societies. So here really we need to make sure that we link both at national level, and we have made a water tracker there to see which countries are actually bringing water into their adaptation strategies, but also to bring it from the local level, how we can work with those areas that actually are sitting on those headwater catchments that need to be protected. So I think just to make the key again that we need to work both on national level and local level and bring those levels closer together. So I think that's going to be our work in the years to come, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rubis. Mr. El-Raghi, over to you. Your one key take.
Yeah, I think we all agreed that there is need for aligning different stakeholders, policies, and on our end, we'll continue working on, hopefully, finding that area where we can help with other stakeholders delivering a quick win, showing that this is a sector where investors can make money, where there is an impact, where on the country level, countries can reach, like as I mentioned, as an example of irrigation, food security. So focusing on aligning stakeholders and having a focused area to have a quick win is something that we're going to be focused on in the coming months/years.
Thank you. And Mr. Ghani, over to you. Last word.
I don't think I can find, I mean, what you guys said is absolutely makes sense. I think for me, I just want policies to be clear. Policies to be clear, a joint effort between local, national, treasury, government treasury, because if it's better that the government will do it than us, but if we need to do it, it's better that local and government work together. So then we can come and really make a big impact, a material investment. Because as I said, material investment can really accelerate this subject in the next couple of years.
Great, thank you. With that, I think we have 2 minutes. If I could quickly maybe summarize, I think our panelists have really discussed quite a lot of issues, but I think some of the themes that have really come out is this need for partnership, right, at all scales, and that there needs to be action on both ends, from both ends, to really sort of address the adaptation challenge. The second piece is the need for alignment in policies and incentives to really push the adaptation investments forward. And then the third piece, I think, that has come out also is this need for innovation, right? And the sort of the new ideas, new funding models that really need to come forward as well. And then fourthly, I would say probably this importance of nature and water, it sounds like, is something that we really do need to focus on, given that that is going to be one of the main channels going forward as to how we might face impacts. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much to the panelists who are here for their contributions and for spending your Saturday morning or afternoon with us. And thank you very much to the audience as well who've attended and sort of discussed or witnessed this discussion with us today. I do really invite you to also contact UNIDO at climatechange@unido.org if you'd like to hear more about what UNIDO is doing on climate change adaptation. But with that, I will close this panel, and thank you very much to all of our panelists. Again, thanks everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nisha.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.